Good morning and welcome to this session, Critical Materials Finding Common Ground. We will be traveling across the world from Indonesia to Greenland, through the United States, and sun, wind. There will be neither energy transition. We are dependent on a number of countries outside of the European Union. This is what Kate Penton said a few weeks ago, and Rosie Manuth, who is member of the European Cour des Comptes and whose institution drew up a rather severe portrait of the European strategy. So I have the pleasure of moderating this roundtable with Bambang Bojonegoro, your General Director of the Asian Development Bank Institute, and you were also Minister of the Economy from 2014 to 2016, and you were also in charge of planning of national development in Indonesia between 2016 and 2019, and you will be able to talk to us about this. Amy Green, you're a specialist in relationships between France, the United States, and the European Union. You're also an associate expert in Manhattan University, and you teach in Boston University also, and you have written a number of books, among which the last one was, remind me of the title? America Faced with Its Fractures. So Christian Kelson, you will bring us a breath of fresh air from Greenland. You are president of the Greenland Business Association, and you will be able to explain to us all of the strategic stakes around Greenland. And first of all, I'll allow Valérie Mignon, who's a member of the Cercle des Économistes, to set the framework for this roundtable. Valérie, over to you. Thank you very much, Patrice, and good morning, everybody. Today, the energy transition and the technological transformation of our economies is based on a whole set of materials that have become essential. In particular, lithium for batteries, coppers in electrical networks, cobalt and nickel, or rare earths, which are used for wind turbines, digital technologies, and certain strategic sectors, such as that of defense. These resources, as you know, are called critical materials. And these materials are now one of the material conditions of the energy transition. And I would say, in addition to this, I would underline here the French choice of the nuclear industry. Without these materials, there would neither be electrification of transport, nor massive deployment of renewable energies, nor large-scale, low-carbon transformation. But this growing importance goes hand in hand with a paradox. Why? Well, because although these materials are necessary for the construction of a more sustainable economic model, their mining and processing and circulation of these materials bring about new vulnerabilities. The first vulnerability is geopolitical. Production and the processing of critical minerals are strongly concentrated in a limited number of countries. China, of course, as you know, occupies a dominant position in a number of the links of the value chain. And the Democratic Republic of Congo produces most of the world's cobalt. And Indonesia has been a key player for nickel, and we will have the opportunity to speak about this later. And this concentration creates strategic dependency, which gives rise to growing importance in a context that is marked by international tension and the return of industrial policies and the will of the states to reinforce their economic sovereignty. So in these contexts, these resources are levers for power or instruments for rivalry. The second vulnerability is economic. Why? Because the global demand for these critical materials will strongly increase in coming decades. And this outlook, therefore, means that there is increased competition for access to resource and for the control of the different steps of the value chain, from mining to the manufacturing of end products. The third vulnerability is environmental and social. Because the energy transition itself is based on mining activities that have basic impacts on territories, on ecosystems, and of course, the populations of the relevant countries. The question, therefore, is not just to produce more, but the question is how do we produce, where, and to the benefit of whom? Faced with these challenges, the objectives pursued are sometimes difficult to reconcile. A few examples. How can we secure the supplies without creating new dependencies? How can we pick up the pace of the energy transition while reducing the environmental impacts of mining? How can we allow producing countries to better valorize their resources without increasing global fragmentation? And how can we develop recycling, innovation, sobriety, while meeting an increasing demand for critical materials? So we see that these questions boil down to a broader question of governance. Critical materials today are at the crossroads of industrial policy, energy transition, economic development, and of course, geopolitics. So deep down, I would say that the question is not to simply get rid of interdependency. It's quite simply no economy can stand alone, but rather to build more balanced, more resilient, and more acceptable interdependencies for all. Therefore, two questions arise. Are critical materials a new field where states and economic blocs will come up against each other, or to the contrary, can they become the support of a more balanced cooperation between producing countries and consuming countries? And above all, what conditions would be necessary to build this common ground that this session is talking about? So it's around these questions that Patrice will now moderate the discussions with our three speakers. Thank you. Thank you, Valerie, for this very clear presentation. Bang Bang Nijuro, you come from a country that has a very great natural wealth with your forests and corals and your wealth of minerals as well. You have 278 million inhabitants. And what is your strategy developed in Indonesia to meet the pressing demand of developed economies, China, of course, United States and Europe, around nickel?
First, thank you for the invitation for this prestigious forum. So let me start with the bit history about nickel in Indonesia. So basically in mid-1960s, Indonesian economy was basically almost bankrupt, hyperinflation, almost no economic growth, government doesn't have enough budget, and there is no source of foreign exchange earning. So the new government that took over from the previous government decided in order to, to restore the economic development, then government started to exploit all natural resources possible at that time, mostly with oil and gas, but also with other types of mining. So at that time, we started also to have gold and copper and also nickel. And just to tell you a bit of history, the first two major players of nickel in Indonesia, number one is Indonesia state-owned enterprise, and the other one is a big company from Canada called INCO. So INCO was the very first big investor in nickel mining in Indonesia. So they are both doing the mining. And of course, the mining itself finally gives kind of positive impact to the economy. First, government revenue through the royalty and tax. And secondly, of course, foreign exchange earning, because basically almost all nickel ore exported to different parts of the world. At that time, the biggest buyer was Japan until almost 2000. And if you remember, the start of China shock in 2000, in which China becomes like the kind of the biggest player in manufacturing. Then suddenly the export of nickel that previously intended for Japan shifted to China. Since I think 2005, 2006, until today basically. So the question is what happened? with this kind of export. Of course, when Japan imported a lot of nickel from Indonesia, maybe it was for their stainless steel industry. You know very well, nickel is like main component for making the stainless steel. And China, we thought at the beginning, is almost the same. Maybe China, because of their industrialization, they need more nickel in order to produce more stainless steel. But lately, we realized that China imported nickel not necessarily only for stainless steel, but at the time, they were developing something that maybe everybody else in the world was not really aware. The EV battery. The EV battery that use nickel as one of the main component. That's why the China domination in Indonesian nickel industry becoming very strong because of they want to secure, of course, the security of the supply for their production. But also when finally Indonesia decided we cannot just being a country that export nickel ore. We need to do more processing. We need to export processed nickel rather than raw nickel. So at the end, 2020, government made decision, we have to stop, we have to ban the export of nickel ore, and then inviting all the investors to open the companies that do the nickel processing. The immediate reaction, of course, coming again from China. They want to secure the nickel. So that's why the majority of investors in doing nickel smelting the nickel into a processed nickel, mostly coming from China. And today, yeah, unfortunately, when we are talking about nickel in Indonesia, it is identical with China. But my point is here, first, Indonesia basically open for everybody. It's just kind of unfortunate at that time, China is the one that very aggressive to come to nickel processing opportunity in Indonesia. But Indonesia and EU just completed the negotiation on Indonesia EU CEPA, Economic Partnership Agreement. And it will be effective starting next year. And we really hope that the EU companies, EU investor can take the opportunity of utilizing nickel in Indonesia. It doesn't have to be for the EV battery, could be for other things. Because when we try to process the nickel or we are trying to strengthen our industrialization using the nickel, we need the new technology coming from outside. And of course, we are really looking for the technology coming from EU. So that's my first point. And the other point, of course, we need to kind of set up the framework about whether nickel itself is clean or not. Of course, when you are talking about nickel mining, you might consider this is not clean according to the environmental standard. But if we look at some of the biggest nickel mining in Indonesia, they use the hydropower in order to support their operation. But quite strangely, when there are many investors trying to set up nickel smelter in Indonesia, majority of them using the coal in order to help their operation. Of course, this is like, from economic perspective, this is very practical because coal is the cheapest and readily available. But of course, if we are talking about the longer term, then I believe the European technology can also help us in making sure if we are doing something with the nickel, it has to be accompanied by the clean technology. So we really invite ideas on the clean technology or related to the energy transition. I think the role of nickel will be very critical for energy transition, aside, of course, being the main component of the stainless steel. Last but not least, Indonesia, I think from the days when we invited majority of the big mining company, always emphasize on environment protection. Of course, there could be some problem here and there, but in general, we have quite strict rule and regulation about environmental protection, and also the company will always be trying to accommodate the local people. I mean, they are not trying to relocate people, but instead they are trying to get the local people also to work with them and also to protect, their right in order to get the access of all the basic infrastructure as well as basic services. So maybe for the beginning, this is my intervention. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Bambang Brojonegoro.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having shown us how Indonesia has tried to scale up by retaining part of the added value, and for explaining the potential relationships between the European Union and Indonesia faced with the growing appetites of China. I turn to you, Christian Kelsen. You're president of Greenland Business Association. Greenland, defined by Donald Trump as the ice El Dorado. Can you explain to us, how what was your experience of this crazy period and this pressure exerted on your country? And what strategy have you developed around critical raw materials? Because according to the European Union, 24 of the critical raw materials listed on the European Union are located in Greenland. Yes, thank you, and thank you for the invitation. In Greenland, we have 4 languages. Unfortunately, French is not one of them.
In English. And if you're wondering what are the languages, we have 3 Inuit languages and Danish that are our languages. And what we've been seeing over many years, the young people are not speaking Danish as a second language anymore. They're actually speaking English, or a version of English that we call YouTube. To go straight to the lump of ice question, Patrice, that's correct. Some consider us a lump of ice. For us, the 56,000 people living in Greenland, it's home. It's a place of culture, it's a place of future, it's a place of opportunity. If you take Greenland, and if you're not familiar with Greenland, we lie between the northern parts of Canada and the North Pole. That's right in between the US and Russia and China on top. If we now move Greenland away and put us over Europe, we are going to be spanning from Oslo in the north to Morocco in the south. And that's 56,000 people. So you can see where France fits in there. It's a little bit of this whole country. We live in 72 different towns and settlements. So the biggest being Nuuk, where I live, 20,000. The smallest being a place of 2 or 3 people. And we have a rule: if there are more employees in the local shop than there are habitants in a settlement, we can close down the shop. But this is a big country. 72 towns and settlements. It's expensive to uphold, but from the perspective of what we're talking about today, we've always had investments in infrastructure. So if you live in a place in Greenland, there is or has been a resource. Someone has invested in maybe just a little bridge or a harbor or a storage facility or a heliport or a runway, but there is a purpose for people being there. As mentioned, Patrice, it's actually 25 of the 34 critical minerals we have on the EU list, 9 of the 18 on the UK, and 43 of the 50 on the US list. So Greenland has a wonderful underground that could potentially pave the way for more autonomy for Greenland. We are today dependent for 95% of exports on fish, and then 58% of our treasury income is from the EU and Denmark through the subventions or the subsidies. So we hold potential. We have 24% of the world's deposits of REMs, that's rare earth minerals. One project alone potentially holds 15%. But we do know that we're just one of many for the EU. The EU has 14 strategic partnerships on critical minerals, putting us in a competitive position against other places in South America, in Africa, and elsewhere. Now, what you will find in Greenland is a stable democracy. You will find laws that are similar to the structures you know from Europe, from Scandinavia. You have an autonomous labor force. you have a high degree of rule of law, generally all the things that we value as Europeans and as in France especially. What's also interesting to know about our mining industry, we've had mines in Greenland for more than 100 years, but we do have a colonial past, and Greenland did not take over the responsibility of the underground until 2009, so that's 17 years ago. Since then, we have opened 3 mines, 1 went bankrupt, and we still have 2 in operation. One is for gold, the other one is for anosticite. And anosticite is a product we're getting a lot of money from NASA for, and apparently the Americans want to put people back on the moon, and anosticite is necessary for this. That's quite interesting. So none of these materials are on the critical or strategic lists. These are other products. If you look to Arctic Canada, it's the same thing. It's iron, it's gold, it's silver. But we do have the deposits of rare earth minerals and other things. Now, what's relevant in terms of mining is whether you have a commodity that somebody wants and that somebody wants to pay for. If there's no demand, you can have as much stuff in your underground, it's not going to make any difference because nobody wants it. Now, we know it's there in Greenland. Our problem is these products to come out and come into production in the European, in the North American industries would require people to pay the prices. We know today that rare earth minerals are not traded at market prices. We're competing against the Chinese that provide 69% of the rare earth minerals, and they are subsidized to some degree. So now all of us as consumers, and all of you Europeans as consumers, you're going to pay possibly the lowest price for your products. And that means manufacturers will still be dependent on products coming out of the Far East, with China being the main driver. We hold some of the rare earth minerals, so does Australia, Myanmar, and the US, Nigeria, Thailand, and in fact, actually, the US could potentially become a very big player on rare earth minerals. What's happened in Europe, what's happened in North America is the refining and the processing. We've moved those plants out of Europe and North America. Those are in Asia. We didn't want the pollution in Europe, and in North America, we had better conditions out there. So we need to be rebuilding the capacity in Europe and North America. Putting Greenland back on the map here, we're close to Europe. In terms of supply lines, we're very close to the northern shores of Europe. We're very close to France. We're very close to the UK, and so on. We left the EU in 1985 over fishing rights, but right now we're discussing a very strong relationship with the EU, and EU account for 4% of our GDP income in terms of subsidies. That could potentially rise over the coming years as we're seeing more institutionalized investments coming into Greenland from Denmark, from the EU, and so on. To build Greenland's industry, it will require investments, it will require financial mechanisms. We could talk about de-risking mechanisms, guarantees of floor prices. This would have to be dealt with at an institutional level. In Europe, for your competitive laws, your antitrust laws, we would need to be discussing these things in order to make Greenland a relevant market, as well as Zimbabwe and other countries around us. So, to finish off, Greenland, political stable, public investments in infrastructure to support anything, there is a commodity, and we have fiscal stability. So we're very comparable to European and to French companies within the industries. And the very final word is, for us in Greenland, we're on a journey towards more autonomy and ultimately sovereignty from Denmark. And the mining industry is seen as one of the avenues in diversifying our economy and reaching this goal. Merci.
Merci beaucoup.
Thanks a lot, Christian. Once again, you've highlighted the potential of relationships with the EU. So we can continue this discussion. Amy Green. So over the past few days, we've heard the declarations and statements about Greenland by Donald Trump. raw materials, commodities, custom tariffs, 40 billion euros in terms of supporting critical metal projects in the US. What is the American strategy? So the strategy advocated by Trump, is it out of touch with the policy of the predecessors, or is there some continuity? Thanks a lot for your invitation. I'm delighted to be with you because this is the 250-year anniversary of my origin country, and we are happy to share that. And relationships between the US and France have been quite rich. We heard about this metaphor of a marriage between the US and France. So I will be talking about the political strategy of the Trump administration and some continuity with the previous administration. But the previous administration was Democrat. So critical materials, this is a very passionate topic. It's a case study to illustrate the main pillars of the foreign policy of the second Trump administration. Strategic competitiveness against China. This is something that is pivotal. It does highlight the international action by the US. Second, nationalism, economic nationalism, in order to reindustrialize the country. This is an extremely important political topic, and Trump has made some promises to the electoral base, and they've lost a lot in terms of deindustrialization of the United States. And third pillar, it's a more transactional type of approach. And what is important is the sphere of influence in the foreign policy in general. So allow me to comment on the main avenues of this strategy. And in order to talk about the disruptive trends and continuity trends, there's a message that I need to disseminate. The US under Trump, they have rediscovered a genuine industrial policy, and the Republican administration is using the tools of the state and the executive tools in order to launch a policy that will handle the topic in a different fashion. The objective is to limit the reemergence of China. I will mention a few examples. Of course, we will be able to revisit those topics a bit in the Pentagon. 1 year ago, Pentagon has become the largest shareholder of a mining company, the only company that is integrated from the extraction and processing of mining. And the state is the biggest shareholder. There were some purchase guarantees. There were floor prices that are being contained in this policy. And there's something that is quite interesting. So a pretext was used to justify the participation of a state in this company. It was about the powers of war. So the Pentagon is a venture capitalist, more venture capitalist than a private company. That's something unprecedented. There's another structural element that enables this administration to embody a policy, the executive architecture. If you read the press, the media, the president likes executive orders. With these executive orders, the president can act unilaterally without the approval of Congress, and he can issue a decrees to launch his policies. When Trump came to power, there were some executive orders that were issued, and they removed the obstacles for extraction. And in January, so 1 year after he came to power, other executive orders were issued in order to remove the obstacles to transformation. So they focused on critical minerals, but what is important is to process the critical minerals, and this is what Trump said in Davos. There is no rare earth minerals. What is important is to process and transform these materials, the rare earth minerals. The state is now a shareholder involved in the private sector strategy. This is a kind of innovation. Then on, I can tell you that there are some contradictions, there are strong tensions at the heart of this American policy. First, you talked about continuity. You have some continuity. Of course, Donald Trump is at the helm of the U.S., but with IRA, Inflation Reduction Act voted upon by the Biden administration. So critical minerals played a key role, but the way of telling the story to the Americans is totally different. For Joe Biden, it was a matter of climate transition. So he said that the U.S. should be independent of China. This is a shared objective with Trump, but it was a broad rationale. He talked about energy and climate transition. Respect for the environment as well, but Donald Trump has different views. So if we were to describe Joe Biden's actions, critical minerals are a transition resources for Donald Trump. This is a resource in order to wage an economic war. So he has decoupled this approach, and Donald Trump is not interested in climate change. So basically, he focused on energy domination. Second type of tension, the societal and environmental consequences, something that we can talk about. There's a policy in order to remove the obstacles so that it's possible to extract on some lands where you have tribes. But the U.S., they need partners. I'm not talking about the allies, because the administration doesn't like the word of allies. But the U.S., they need allies in order to thwart the Chinese dominance. So there's a threat against Greenland with hostile rhetoric, with the customs tariffs. We have the Ukraine issue, we have the Greenland issue. By way of conclusion, allow me to talk about Trump's approach. There are two different cases. There's a deal with Ukraine. You have the threats against Greenland, but it does highlight the transactional approach adopted by Donald Trump for Ukraine, something that we can talk about. For Ukraine, there's a challenge. If you want to get access to American protection, if you want to get access to American markets, you have to pay for it. We are no longer the powerful benefactors. I mean, you pay to play. You buy in order to play. So in Ukraine, you've got the same attempt, and for Greenland, it's the same approach. It's a little bit different, and this has to do with the foreign policy of Trump, because Greenland, what it's all about, it is strategic competition against China to frustrate China with Arctic ambitions.
So indeed, there's this need for energy dominance, but there's also the question of the sphere of influence, where Greenland is part of America's sphere. Donald Trump, in his national security strategy, added a doctrine to the Monroe Doctrine that says that the United States must have their word to say and act throughout the hemisphere where they want and when they want. And so Greenland participates in his project, which goes from Greenland, from the Arctic, to the bottom of Chile. And so indeed, there we will have the desire to exert influence and power in a dominating position with regard to these countries, to show that the United States are able to confront the sphere that built China. Thank you. It's very interesting to see that there is a real strategy that we couldn't imagine a few years ago, that the Pentagon would invest in a mining company. You said pay to play. It's a transactional process and a process of domination. So this will be the first question to launch the debate. Despite everything, can we imagine agreements? What could lead to the beginning of an agreement between the United States, the European Union, and Japan around this subject? Is it the idea of securing these sectors despite everything?
Yes, to have a tripartite presence. To send a clear message in the neighborhood countries of China, but we need to take on board the European partners. I mean, I listened to a speaker yesterday who was very candid about American expectations. So try to assume what you want to do and what you don't want to do. And the US and Europe can work together. They can coordinate their policies. And I think that Europe has to cooperate with the US. That's a paradox, so to speak. But it is quite exceptional because the strategy of the US is to focus on bilateralism. They signed an agreement with Australia, with Ukraine. So what is important is to have a tripartite approach. This is quite rare for this administration, but in fact, they closed down multilateralism in the international bodies and they want to turn their back on the alliances of the past. But on this front, it's a good example of an exception. It's a matter of having a transactional type of multilateralism. But of course, these are still intentions so far. We'll see what come out of it. Mr. Brojo Negoro, you talked about cooperation with the EU. There are some agreements. You've talked about clean technologies. What do you expect from this cooperation? Can you tell me if there are some operators in Europe that you've identified that could help you develop the mining sector, but at the same time participating in your strategy in order to get zero carbon net emission in 2060?
Yeah, I think the clean technology that we need from, at least from the EU side, there are two types of category. First, to support the energy transition, especially when it comes to the renewable energy, technology to generate renewable energy. And the secondly, for the manufacturing itself. So first, when we are talking about getting more value added for our nickel production, then of course we cannot limit ourselves only to EV from China. Of course, so far they are like the biggest consumer of our nickel process. So we expect from Europe, of course, some of the automotive industry in Europe also already get into the EV production. And of course you need the battery because basically battery is the main part of the EV. So maybe there are kind of new technology for EV battery from Europe that can really utilize the nickel from Indonesia. And of course, we hope that the technology will be the clean one. On the area of the renewable energy, what I'm thinking is this. Of course, you mentioned about our ambition to reach net zero emission by 2060. And in order to do that, of course, we have to have enough renewable energy to substitute the existing fossil fuel, especially coal, and also the gasoline. So in order to do that, of course, we can rely on solar panel, we can rely on wind, but remember, they are intermittent, so it means at the end, we need the battery. So when we need the battery, of course, we expect the Euro technology can help us in making sure that our transition into net zero will be smooth. Otherwise, many people in Indonesia are really worried that if we rely or if we shift drastically now to solar, wind especially, then we might have problem because we don't have enough base load for our electricity. And base load can either be from nuclear, which is also kind of the clean technology that Indonesia could adopt from EU, especially from France. And secondly, we are talking about the battery. I mean, it's okay to have electricity from the wind, from the solar, but it has to be accompanied by the battery in order to secure the base load. And the battery technology is still quite expensive today. So the type of clean technology that Indonesia really needs from Euro will be on the battery issue. And last but not least, when everybody starts to move into EV using a lot of battery, then there will be the need of recycling business because the battery maybe in 5 or 10 years will be the waste. So when they become the waste, we need recycling kind of technology. And this is another clean technology that we could adopt, hopefully, from Europe.
Donc l'importance aussi du recyclage et des technologies.
The importance of recycling and the European technologies to help you. The importance of recycling and the importance of the imports of European technologies in order to get some extraction processes that are as clean as possible. Last question, the weight of China. Is the Indonesian government implemented a policy in order to control Chinese investments?
We don't have specific kind of instrument to limit the Chinese investment because basically we are open to anybody. But of course, when it comes to the opportunity, then the government of Indonesia will entertain the one that comes to Indonesia with serious proposal, solid financing, and of course, at the end, the smooth implementation. And yeah, to be honest, I mean, if I compare Indonesia, let's say before 2000 and Indonesia after 2000, before 2000, whenever we are talking about FDI, we are talking about Japan, US, and Euro. But then when it comes to after 2000, then Japan is still there, US still there, especially in the mining industry, but somehow European is declining, replaced by China. And China becomes more aggressive, and especially when they trying to set their foot in the EV industry, they become very aggressive. They want to really secure any materials that will help them to kind of dominate the EV industry in the world.
Merci. Christian Kelson, sur justement les relations avec lui.
Mr. Carlson, the relationships with the EU in the years to come, given the strategic importance of the resources of Greenland, what can you envisage regarding? So what is important is to comply with the environmental requirements, and at the same time, there's a need for Europe to get access to some resources. How do you reconcile all of that?
Thank you. And I just put those on to make sure I understood the question, because I tend to answer anyway if I misunderstand the question. But I think I got it. I think if you look to the US, they're very transactional, as Amy said. And if you look to Europe, it's very value-based. And I think that's where the compliance or the alignment between Greenland and the EU lies. We have the same values, we share values, we are values-based. When it comes to mining in Greenland, what's been important to Greenland is to find companies and countries to cooperate with that share our social contract. Now, it's a somewhat unusual situation for a country to say we only want to sell our products to the right customer. That's very, very unusual, but that is technically what Greenland is saying, or the former government was saying. You have to be in on our social contract, and we have to be a supplier into the green transition. So Greenland has actually set fairly high standards for sustainability, for social standards, environmental standards, and it's a luxury, and I put it in brackets because it is a luxury because we're building an industry, so we can actually set the standards high now instead of starting low and then trying to come up with higher standards later on once we're in production. So for Greenland, it's very important to be close to best in class on environmental standards, and I do believe that sits very well with the EU.
Merci. Amy Green, je reviens vers vous justement.
Amy Green, back to you. In Europe, there were lots of tensions between Greenland and the US regarding critical minerals. Concretely, what has been negotiated? We don't know exactly.
Yes, indeed. That is emblematic of what we were saying earlier on in your intervention. The fact that there's a great deal of tension on this three-party agreement, but it's very difficult to get going afterwards. But in this agreement, a few concessions were gained by Ukraine. Typically, the Trump administration had floated the idea that it be the rare earths that were used to refund the American investments in the Ukrainian war. And then the Ukrainians managed to remove that part. But this is an example where we can see that Ukraine has well negotiated its side of things. Nevertheless, the big defect of this agreement is that there is no security guarantee. The Americans ended up by negotiating something, which means that they remain in Ukraine whilst this is being negotiated. But that's why it's very difficult to see materialization of this agreement or concrete applications, because part of the resources negotiated in this agreement are under Russian occupation. It's impossible to access them or to use them. The production time, once Ukraine will be able to come back and mine them and process them, would be very lengthy. It could be a decade, and it could be longer. And therefore, it's very difficult to see how the United States will truly benefit from this agreement. And this is where we come back to this notion of attention and on this transactional approach, because there is no security guarantee. But what the Americans are saying to the Ukrainians is that we will be there as long as you're an interest for our national needs. And this goes through critical minerals, and in other countries, it can involve other topics. And it means that we're hanging on to you, but just for as long as it's in our interest, and we will look for possibilities or to achieve this. And what you said about Greenland and Europe and the United States is very interesting. It's true that it is part of the things that Europeans have trouble understanding about the States, but also the Americans have trouble understanding the Europes. There's no more sentimentality for Europe and America. Well, there's this history. There's a lengthy history, common history, but we no longer share the same values. And in Washington, they're expecting concrete proposals for the better or for the worse. I'm not there to bear any judgments, but this is the reality. We can see this applied in the Ukrainian case. We don't care about values, but if we can get something out of you, then we'll stay. So thank you. Let me come back to the environmental questions, and I turn to you. In Indonesia, there was a case in the archipelago of Raja Ampat in 2005 with 4 of the 5 companies operating there who saw their license removed by the Indonesian government. So what characterizes Indonesia is a lot of indigenous populations that live from fishing or in the forest, and their lifestyle is threatened. So how does the Indonesian government concretely take into account these indigenous populations today? And are they heard? Is their voice heard?
Yeah, I think so far their voice and, of course, their condition have been taken into account seriously by the government. I mean, both central and also local government. And also, I think most importantly, Indonesia has transformed itself for a very centralized country before 2000. And after year of 2000, Indonesia became decentralized. And then part of our decentralization, we have so-called spatial autonomy. And this spatial autonomy, especially to kind of respect the existence of some of the indigenous group of people. And related to your question, quite interestingly, this spatial autonomy also applies to the region that has basically a rich natural resources, mining, as well as like forestry area. So in general, at least on the paper, government has already accommodated all the kind of instrument to protect the locals. But of course, when it comes to some issues, for example, the issues of the natural disasters, then there are problems sometimes because usually the government, especially the local government, is kind of overwhelmed by the size of disaster itself, like what happened in the early this year when we had a big kind of flood in the northern part of Sumatra, and part of the problem could be attributed to the kind of the forest issue. But of course, in general, we have taken care majority of the indigenous people issue and also trying to protect everybody from the aftermath of the disaster.
Merci. Il nous reste 5 minutes.
Thank you. We have 5 minutes left. Are there any questions from the room? Short question for short answers, please. We have only 5 minutes. Short question. Dear Minister from Indonesia, we're here to talk about rare earths. But for the Indonesian, I think that Indonesia is a rare earth in itself. And so the plantations destroy forests. And a few years back, the European Union was obliged to develop a contract for the purchase of herbicides. So either in Indonesia, you say, what can you tell us about these contracts around agriculture and?
Well, I think in general, of course, there has been some activities like plantation, palm oil plantation, and also mining, especially coal mining, that could affect the environmental balance in some parts of Indonesia. And we admit that we might be kind of too aggressive when it comes to the expansion, especially on the palm oil plantation. But I think since a couple years ago, I forgot exactly which year, we have done so-called, we have basically stopped every kind of natural forest conversion, tropical forest conversion into palm oil plantation. So there will be no more kind of new permit, new license for company to expand or to open a new palm oil plantation. Instead, they have to be kind of more productive without really expanding the area. So at least we know that, there has been some tension between the European Union and Indonesia, but thankfully, because we finally have completed the negotiation through Indonesia-EU Economic Partnership Agreement, then hopefully the problem in the past could be solved in the near future. At least we have tried to start our homework in stopping the expansion of palm oil, and that's why the idea of creating more value added from our natural resources will be very important. Otherwise, Indonesia will always depend on kind of primary product, mining, plantation. So if you rely too much on the primary product, then you will need more expansion. And then you will convert more natural forests or tropical forests into a productive, so-called, into commercial land for both plantation and mining.
Merci beaucoup. Autre question?
Oui. Thank you very much. Any other questions? Yes, hello everybody. Thank you for your presentations. My question will be to you, sir, Mr. Bojonegoro. According to my research, Indonesia offered to become organized in a cartel with the meat-producing companies in 2022. Why did this project not come to life, and could this still be in the future strategy of Indonesia under the UPEP? The cartel project that was proposed in 2022 by the Minister of Investment in Indonesia. Creating a sort of a cartel for minerals. Creating a cartel for minerals, OPEC.
Yeah, I was actually former minister, and I already out of cabinet since 2021, so I might not be familiar too much. But yeah, I believe cartel, or basically, like OPEC type of mineral would be good idea. But I think in the era of the open market, so far, this is again my observation as an economist, the type of cartel or the type of the cooperation among producing countries now may be less effective than before. I mean, if you remember the OPEC itself, it was very powerful during 1970s up to 1990s, but OPEC's kind of influence becomes a little bit down, and now basically we haven't even heard, you know, the OPEC voice when there is problem with the Hormuz Strait, when there is a problem with the supply of the oil itself. So maybe, again, this is more on my personal opinion, the idea of making this cartel type of mineral could be a kind of difficult and maybe less effective in the current situation, in the current geopolitical and geoeconomic fragmentation. Sorry if I cannot really answer your question.
Merci, Bambang Brojonei Goro, pardon. Ce sera...
Thank you very much. That will be the final word because this brings us to the end of the round table. Thank you to Christian Kelson. Thank you to Amy Green. Thank you, Valerie Mignon. And I think that if our guests are still here, they will no doubt be happy to answer a few questions now.